particularly apt comparison. Cannabis is dramatically safer than alcohol. Dramatically safer than alcohol. It's not even in the same ballpark. My name is Kirk Tousaw. I'm a barrister. I'm also the founder and executive director of an organization called Beyond Prohibition Foundation, which is working towards a regulatory model for cannabis. I've been active in attempting to reform cannabis laws in the United States and Canada really since high school. My first sort of act in that regard was to hang a legalized marijuana now poster in my high school at age 16 when the governor was coming to visit. An act of free speech that caused some consternation at the school. And cannabis prohibition in particular affects more people in this country directly than any of the other drug prohibitions, because there's, quite frankly, just more people using cannabis. There's some 700,000 Canadians that use cannabis on a daily basis. There's another 1.3 million Canadians that use cannabis on a weekly basis. Last year we set a record for cannabis arrests for simple possession at 50,000 arrests. It's a discriminatory policy, and it's heartening to me, and I thank CSSDP for the work they put on in this conference, to see young people actively being engaged in this issue, because I think with cannabis more than any other substance, most people know where to get it. Most people that use it, since so many people do, aren't going to have significant negative legal repercussions. But the people that are primarily targeted, the people that do, aren't people that are 38 years old and have a house and a steady supply of cannabis and don't have to go to the street to get it. It's mostly young people that are getting caught up in these possession arrests, and that can really tar your record going forward. Police like to say, well, we don't really arrest people for marijuana possession, and that's just simply not true. 50,000 people last year were arrested for simple possession of marijuana, and they face significant consequences. You have to sort of think about things that you don't normally think about when you're talking about drug policy reform. At least I don't normally think about it. I'm a criminal defense lawyer. When I talk about drug policy, I think about police, courts, prosecution, sentencing, jail. What does that look like, and how do we deal with that? But when you want to flip that around and talk about regulation of substances, you have to think about a whole variety of other issues that frankly I slept through in law school. Zoning, administrative law. More than anything else, I think we have to recognize that if we want cannabis to be legal, we have to accept the fact that it's going to be regulated in a way that we regulate other businesses. The other things to think about is, who controls the market? And Riel mentioned this. Is it going to be a federal issue? Is it going to be a provincial issue? Is it going to be a municipal issue? Is there going to be an interrelated dialogue between those three levels of jurisdiction? We have to figure out who's going to make the rules. What's the role of a municipality? What are the interactions with these existing regulatory models like zoning and business licensing and time, place, and manner restrictions? And so I did something I thought was pretty intuitive. I took the BC Liquor Control Act, and I did time flies when you're having fun. I did basically a find replace, and I got rid of liquor and put in cannabis. And then I went through and I cleaned it up, right? I mean, and you'd be surprised. On a first read, 70-some sections of this act, you just replace one word. It's actually not that hard to envision what the model looks like. Sure, you have to clean some things up. You have to change some things around, like you don't distill cannabis necessarily. I mean, there is a tendency to say, and a tendency to sort of want to aim towards more of a free-for-all approach. And I think Donald's slide demonstrated some of the problems with a free-for-all approach. You run into situations where there are abuses. There are abuses like advertising and promotion of substances. There are abuses like deceptive sales practices, saying things that aren't true about potential risks, the targeting of minors with interesting and cute ads like Joe the Camel for tobacco. There's the problems associated with closed shops or monopolistic practices. All of these things can happen to cannabis just as well as they happen to other substances, and so we have to be a little bit careful about that. The flip side of that, the sort of bookend of that, though, is a tight highly super regulated model for cannabis, and that has its own set of problems. One is it probably doesn't get rid of the black market. And if we want to get rid of the black market, we have to realize the restrictions can't be so tight to amount to essentially a quasi-prohibition. And so we don't want to have a sort of government monopoly necessarily. We don't want to have a system that infringes on the human rights, the charter rights of medicinal users, of spiritual users of cannabis, of people who are going to continue to be discriminated against unless we have a model that takes into account their issues. Other sort of practical aspects of the problem are, what can we sell to regulators and to the public? It's probably on a risk-based assessment fair to say that cannabis ought to be treated closer to something like coffee than something like pharmaceutical drugs. The reality of life in this country and across the world is we're not going from a criminal prohibition to cannabis being sold in a free market, free-for-all, unregulated environment. You can't sell that plan to either the public or the people who are ultimately going to make the decision. And so, in some respects, we have to be aware of what we can achieve first before we sort of have the next battle. And the first battle, to me, is the most important. Let's do away with prohibition. Let's have a legal and regulated system. If you have to deal with maybe some of the regulations being a little too tight, let's deal with that after we've cleared the first hurdle. The other things to think about is, who controls the market? And Riel mentioned this. Is it going to be a federal issue? Is it going to be a provincial issue? Is it going to be a municipal issue? Is there going to be an interrelated dialogue between those three levels of jurisdiction? In some ways, we sort of have it easy here in Canada. In order to end prohibition, we only have to change the federal law. But in order to enact a working regulatory model, we have to do so much more than that. We have to figure out who's going to make the rules. What's the role of a municipality? What are the interactions with these existing regulatory models like zoning and business licensing and time, place, and manner restrictions? Because while we want change, we're scared to death of change, right? And so I think Donald summarized that quite well. We need to change prohibition, but I think we need to replace it with a model that has some familiarity and some comfort level amongst the various stakeholders. And I talk about the public, I talk about the politicians who have to implement it, but also civil servants, persons within the bureaucracy. There has to be a role and a defined role for these people, and the more comfort level you can build, I think the easier it will be to implement that particular scheme. But what does the Cannabis Control Act do? Well, it creates a Cannabis Control and Licensing Branch. That's the first thing the BC Liquor Control Act does. It creates an administrative body to oversee the regulatory structure. It imposes penalties for violating the Act, including some severe penalties for things like selling to minors intentionally, $50,000 or a year in jail. And if we can give a blueprint, if we can stand up and say not just legalize marijuana, which we agree with, but legalize marijuana, regulate marijuana, and by the way, this is how we do it, and the model already exists. We don't have to recreate the wheel, we just have to fund it, staff it, make it happen, and then we can sort of work on the additional details and freedoms as we move through a legal and regulated environment. But it's certainly a significantly positive step from where we are today, which is an unregulated marketplace, and that's controlled largely by organized criminal enterprises, and that causes a significant amount of harm to just about everybody that comes into contact with that particular system. So hopefully that'll spark a bit of discussion later, and thanks again to CSSDP for putting this on. Thanks for your time.